Good evening. You will be happy to know that you are part of the largest crowd in the history of this foundation's Center for Public Affairs events. My name is John Heubusch. I am the Executive Director of the Ronald Reagan Presidential Foundation. It is my pleasure to welcome all of you here this evening. Before we get started, I would like to recognize a few people in our audience. First, I'd like to welcome Ventura County Supervisor Peter Foy. Peter, thank you for coming. Janice Gallagly, the wife of our terrific representative in Congress, Elton Gallagly, is also with us. From the city of Simi Valley, Glenn Becerra, Steve Soika, Barbara Williamson, and Mike Siddell. Thank you for coming tonight. And thank you so much for all you do for this organization. Finally, I would also like to extend a warm welcome to several members of our Foundation Board of Trustees who are with us here this evening. Mr. Boone Pickens and his wife, Madeline. Mr. Jim Pattison and his wife, Mary. Mr. Michael Castine and his son, Peter. And Mr. Brad Freeman. Before I introduce our special guest tonight, I'd like to ask all of you to please take a moment here to turn off your cell phones or pagers. And once Mrs. Reagan arrives, please remain standing for the Pledge of Allegiance. It is now my distinct honor to introduce to you former First Lady of the United States, Nancy Reagan, and former Secretary of State, Condoleezza Rice, escorted by Fred Ryan, Jr., Chairman of the Board of Trustees of the Ronald Reagan Presidential Foundation.
While you're standing, could I please ask you to join us in the Pledge of Allegiance as we do for every event here at the Reagan Library in recognition of our U.S. military troops. Pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you, and please be seated. Well, on behalf of Mrs. Reagan and the Board of Trustees of the Reagan Presidential Foundation, it's my pleasure to welcome each of you to the Reagan Library today for this meeting of our Perspectives on Leadership series. Over the years at the Reagan Library, we've been pleased to welcome many people of great accomplishment. Some have been prominent scholars. Others have been top players in global diplomacy. We've even had world-class musicians and knowledgeable sports experts. Some of the people we've welcomed here have been incredible role models that personify the greatness of our country. Well, our special guest tonight represents every one of those attributes. Her service to our country has included Senior Director of Soviet and East European Affairs in the National Security Council, National Security Advisor to the President, and Secretary of State. And in each role, Condoleezza Rice has helped lead the development of America's global policy in the most critical moments of the last half-century. German reunification, the collapse of the Soviet Empire, the fall of the Soviet Union itself, later the 9/11 attacks, the launch of the War on Terror, the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, all found the nation calling on her leadership, insight, and deep expertise. Her success and influence has not gone unnoticed. Time magazine listed her as one of the 100 most influential people in the world, 4 times. Forbes magazine has twice ranked her as the world's most powerful woman. She was born in Birmingham, Alabama in 1954. She entered college at the age of 15, graduated at 19, later obtained a PhD, had college professorships following that, culminating in her tenure during the 1990s as provost of Stanford University. But becoming a leader in academia and a major player on the international affairs were actually her backup goals in life. Her first choice was to star as another kind of player on another kind of stage. She wanted to be a concert pianist. In fact, in 2002, she demonstrated her considerable musical gifts when she became the first Secretary of State to ever accompany a major musician, Yo-Yo Ma, on a Washington stage. She is also a self-described sports fanatic, and had she not agreed to serve as America's top diplomat, she could have managed a sports team or a major sports franchise. Madam Secretary, I understand the manager's position at the Washington Nationals is open. Well, the loss to the worlds of music and sports brought incalculable gains to America's foreign policy and national security. Please join me in welcoming to the Reagan Library our nation's 66th Secretary of State, Condoleezza Rice.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very, very much. Thank you for that wonderful, warm welcome. It is always so great to be here at the Reagan Library, one of the truly transformational presidents of all time in our history, and it's an honor to speak from this podium. It's especially an honor to join my good friend and my mentor in many ways, Nancy Reagan, again. Thank you, Nancy, for continuing this great work. Well, Fred did say that I had the great honor of accompanying Yo-Yo Ma. That is true. I went to college as a music major, decided after a couple of years that I was pretty good but not great, and was going to probably end up teaching 13-year-olds to murder Beethoven, or perhaps playing at Nordstrom but not playing Carnegie Hall. And I just want everyone to know that I was not confused about why I got to accompany Yo-Yo Ma. It was a good thing I changed my major. And so it was indeed a great honor to do that. And I love music. I love sports. It's great to be able to do so many things in this country. And these days, it's great to be able to do them without getting up and reading the newspaper and thinking that I have to do something about what's in it. So it's been a nice transition back home to California. I'd like to spend a few minutes tonight before we open up for questions talking about a subject that's been very much on my mind as I look through the difficult and critical circumstances in which we find ourselves. Because I'm quite convinced that when times are hard, it's the most important thing that you can do is to go back to first principles, to go back to your values, to go back to what guides you, the lodestar that should move you forward. And so I'd like to entitle my remarks tonight, the few remarks that I'll make about foreign policy, Why Democracy Matters. And it's a bit odd, I think, that a former Secretary of State would have to actually defend the proposition that democracy matters. But I think we'd better start defending that proposition. You know, in part, I'm driven to talk about this because I served in a pretty controversial and consequential time the last 8 years. But as many controversial matters that came before us. The one that seems to have been most controversial was to speak firmly for the democracy agenda, for the freedom agenda. People said we were too idealistic to believe that democracy could spread to corners where it had never taken root, that it was impractical somehow, that somehow it was not serving U.S. interests to speak strongly and firmly for the rights of every man, woman, and child to live in freedom, that somehow it was not practical to believe that people, regardless of their station in life, regardless of their culture, regardless of their circumstances, would want to enjoy the very rights that we all enjoy. That somehow that was impractical and it was too idealistic. But you know, standing for democracy as the United States of America is both practical and right. And that's the proposition that I want to defend to you tonight. The United States has got to stand for the universality of freedom and the universality of democracy. And it has to stand for it because it is right, it is the moral thing to do, but also because it is in our interest to do so. President Reagan, in his second inaugural, had one simple line that captured that. He said, "America must remain freedom's staunchest defender, for freedom is our best ally." Remain a staunch defender because it is right, but also because freedom is our best ally. Democracy, of course, is the institutionalization of freedom. And so it is not just that every man, woman, and child ought to be free, but they ought to live in societies and be governed in ways that actually institutionalize and protect those freedoms. Whether it is the freedom of speech, the freedom of conscience, the freedom to worship as one pleases, the freedom of association, the freedom to choose those who will govern you, the freedom to be free from the knock of the secret police, the freedom to be free from the arbitrary power of the government. These are the institutionalizations of freedom that we call democracy. And it is clearly in our interest when around the world, country after country, ruler after ruler, leader after leader, has to recognize that these freedoms are universal and that they should be allowed for every man, woman, and child. No man, woman, or child should be condemned to live in tyranny. So why is this proposition so controversial? Well, there are several objections. One, that you cannot impose democracy. You cannot impose it by bayonet point. You cannot impose it from abroad. This is most certainly true. But the fact of the matter is, if we look around the world, and we look, for instance, at the recent events in Iran, we see something that I think is a fundamental truth. You don't actually have to impose democracy. You have to impose tyranny. If men, women, and children are asked, do they want to have a say in their future, or would they have it dictated to them from on high? They will choose to have a say in their future. And so you don't impose democracy, you impose tyranny. What about the argument that there are people who are perhaps just not ready for democracy? Well, this to me is one of the most patronizing things that one can say. We are ready, but they're not. And by the way, it's been said at various times about a lot of people. It was said once that Latin Americans weren't ready for democracy. They were given to military juntas and coups. They didn't care about democracy. It was once said that Africans didn't care about democracy. They were just too tribal. And of course, it didn't matter to them that they had a right to have a say in their future. And by the way, it was once said of black people, they were too childlike. They didn't care about the vote. They weren't really ready for democracy. Well, of course, everyone is ready for freedom and ready for democracy. It may well be that economic circumstances are such that it makes democracy hard. It may well be that the absence of traditions in democracy make democracy hard. It may well be that the absence of civil society, of a strong fabric to society, makes democracy hard. But saying that democracy is hard and saying that someone is not ready for democracy are two very different things. The idea that there are some who are just not ready for democracy is both patronizing and it is insidious. Third, there's the argument that perhaps countries can go through authoritarian capitalism and do quite well anyway. So why bother with democracy? And of course, the example that's most often given here is China. They're doing quite well, thank you very much, with authoritarian capitalism. But one has to wonder if this is a long-term proposition for success. Because after all, it's awfully hard to tell people that they can think at work but not at home. And one wonders if the tremendous economic success of China, that is clearly quite extraordinary, is not creating the kinds of strains and stresses in that society that ultimately will not be dealt with by a rigid political system governed from the top down. I don't mean to suggest that China is in danger of collapse, but there's one wonderful thing about democracy. It's big, and it's messy, and it's chaotic. Someone once called it controlled chaos. Well, you might wonder sometimes about the controlled piece. But it is accordion-like. It is capable of giving people institutions in which they can try and resolve their differences peacefully. It is capable of giving people a say in how those differences are resolved. And finally, in the final analysis, if you don't like those who are governing you, you can throw the bums out. And that, more than anything, is the final shock absorber. And you see in China instead growing strains and stresses from this tremendous economic and social upheaval. You know, we've seen it in many ways. We've seen it recently with these riots among Uyghurs. The people of East Turkmenistan, as the Chinese call it, who are unable to express themselves because if there is difference and it is in a dictatorial society, there's only one way to deal with it. Somebody suppresses somebody. And so ethnic rights tend not to be protected in authoritarian societies. We saw it when China had difficulty after the earthquake explaining to the parents of Chengdu, a place that I visited after the earthquake, why the school collapsed and killed children, but the party headquarters, just a little way away, didn't collapse. And the anger of those parents at the shoddy workmanship in that school was palpable. They had really nowhere to go. We saw it in the product safety issue in China, where the government seemed to be unable to deal with it, and where their solution was to execute the guy who dealt with product safety. Now, this is not a long-term solution because sooner or later, nobody's going to want to deal with product safety. And so the question for authoritarian capitalism is, in the long run, can it reach an equilibrium? Can it tell its people to get wealthier, to have greater property interest, and still to allow politics to be held in the hands of a very few? I think not. There is finally the argument, perhaps more difficult, and mostly used in the Middle East, that when you have democracy, when you have elections, before a society is fully matured in civil society and the like, sometimes the bad guys win. And what do you do when the bad guys win? Well, we faced this quite a few times during the period of my tenure in office. We saw Hamas win in the 2006 elections in the Palestinian territories. We saw Hezbollah do well in the 2007 elections in the 2005 elections in Lebanon. We saw Islamist parties do well in the first elections in Iraq. But you know, an interesting thing has happened. The second time around, the extremists have not done very well at all. And one wonders why that is. Well, I would suggest to you that while elections are not the only step that one must take toward democracy, they are a fully necessary step. And what you see is that in authoritarian societies, particularly in the Middle East, there was politics going on, but it was going on in the radical mosques and it was going on in the radical madrasas. And decent political forces were not allowed to organize. And in that freedom gap, as a group of Arab intellectuals called it, you got not only the organization of the most extreme forces, but you also got the kind of nihilist forces like Al-Qaeda, a different kind of politics. Decent political forces did not come into being in the Middle East. But now in freer environments like Lebanon and Iraq, and even the Palestinian territories, you are seeing that decent political forces the second time around are doing better. So in Lebanon, my favorite example, Hezbollah lost in this last election. Now, why did Hezbollah lose? Well, in part because it turns out that they weren't the great resistance movement. They used their arms against the Lebanese people in May of 2007. And you know what? The Lebanese people had a way to punish them. They punished them at the ballot box. Where else could the Lebanese people have punished a terrorist group like Hezbollah? You see in Iraq that in the most recent provincial elections, the Islamist parties, the most extreme parties, the parties funded by Iran, lost. And more decent political parties did better. I think that it is quite possible that what we will see is that as elections take place, in the first round, the bad guys may indeed win because they're the best organized. They were in the radical mosques. They were in the radical madrasas. But as time goes on, the slogan, make your children, vote for us, and we will make your children suicide bombers, won't do very well at the ballot box. And if decent political forces with a different message can come forward, then this will turn out for the better. So I don't think that there are really good arguments for those who say that either the United States should not advocate for democracy, should not make it a pillar of foreign policy, or that we should just wait until it somehow naturally emerges, as if democracy somehow naturally emerges. People fight for democracy, and America has to be their ally in that fight. To be sure, elections are not sufficient. We have to support democratically elected governments because one important thing happens when people go to the ballot box, they expect more of their governments. And that's why foreign assistance in the Bush administration, we attempted to tie to democratic processes, to good governance, to the absence of corruption, and it's why countries like Ghana, that President Obama just visited, were granted huge amounts of money for their size, more than $500 million to Ghana, or Tanzania, more than $800 million to Tanzania, because these were places that were trying to govern wisely, trying to govern democratically, and they need support so that their people can see that they can deliver. It's also true that it's not a straight line. There will be ups and downs. It will go back and forth. And part of the issue is not to lose heart when it does. Because we have to remember that history has a long tail, not a short one. I used to make not very many friends in the press when I would say to them that today's headlines and history's judgment are rarely the same. But it is true. If you look to any point in time, you can see that there were times when something looked so impossible, and not very long after, it just seemed inevitable. You know, at the State Department, I used to take people through a little soliloquy about the period immediately after World War II to demonstrate this point. Because I was lucky enough in 1989 to 1991 to be the White House Soviet specialist at the end of the Cold War. It doesn't get much better than that. But I was harvesting good decisions that had been taken for a long time before. And if you went to work at the State Department in 1946, you faced the French communists winning 46% of the vote and the Italian communists 48% of the vote. In 1947, civil war in Greece and civil conflict in Turkey, 2 million Europeans still starving, necessitating the Marshall Plan. In 1948, the Berlin crisis, the recognition of Israel by Harry Truman setting off war in the Middle East. In 1948, Czechoslovakia falls to a communist coup. In 1949, the Soviet Union explodes a nuclear weapon 5 years ahead of schedule. The Chinese communists win. And in 1950, the Korean War broke out. Would you have dreamed that in 1991, the hammer and sickle would come down from the Kremlin for the last time? 75 years of communism, never mind. And in 2006, the President of the United States would attend a NATO summit in Latvia. Those things that once seemed impossible, in retrospect, seem inevitable. And so history has a long tail. And our part is to do what is right for history, not what is right for the day's headlines. That was the essence of Ronald Reagan. I can remember, quite frankly, when Ronald Reagan gave his landmark speech and called the Soviet Union an evil empire, said that it would end up on the ash heap of history. And I have to admit, I thought, oh my goodness, how undiplomatic. But you know, it was right. And it was calling it as he saw it. And in calling as he saw it, he emboldened a whole generation of people who knew that they were living in a society and in a state that was a lie. And he spurred leaders like Mikhail Gorbachev to try not to destroy the system, but to reform it. But of course, it was rotten to the core. And in trying to reform it, Gorbachev did destroy it. And this mighty Soviet Union, with 30,000 nuclear weapons, 5 million men under arms, stretching 12 time zones, collapsed without a shot. History has a long tail, but that long tail only comes out in our favor if we're true throughout that entire period to our values and to our principles. Now, we have to stand for democracy, and we cannot be neutral about what form of government is right. We have to know that it takes time. But there is one other thing that we have to do. We have to continue, of course, to work on our own democracy, because ours, too, is a work in progress. I loved representing this great country. George Shultz once said that being Secretary of State was the best job in government. Well, George should know he held every other job in government, and therefore he had some ways for comparison. But as Secretary of State, you get to represent the United States of America. And I'll tell you something, the United States of America is the freest, the most compassionate, and the most generous country on the face of the earth. And whatever the world's problems, they would be far, far worse if the United States were not also the most powerful state on the face of the earth. And so many times I had the chance, as I represented the United States, to talk to people who were still struggling to come to democracy in Iraq and Afghanistan, Palestinians, and so forth. And I could speak from the perspective of someone who knows that our democracy was far from perfect at its birth. My ancestors were 3/5 of a man in that first Constitution. As a daughter of the segregated South, who could not go to a restaurant until I was 10 years old, I knew America's foibles, I knew America's challenges, and I could say, We stand for democracy not because we are perfect, but because we're imperfect, and because we know that only with democratic institutions to point toward can people strive day in and day out for that more perfect union. But I also got to see something else that in times like these harden me quite a lot and make me optimistic in that way that really only Americans are optimistic. I got to see what it is that people really love abroad, around the world, about the United States. And it relates to our great national myth. Now, a myth is not something that is untrue. It's just something that's a little bit outsized. And, you know, for some countries, that great national myth is, we had that land in 1389 and lost it, and we're going to get it back. That is not a healthy national myth. Our national myth is the log cabin. You can come from humble circumstances and you can do great things. It doesn't matter where you came from, it only matters where you're going. And that's what people admire about America. They may fear our military power, they may resent our economic power. Sometimes they think we're a bit naive and a bit idealistic. But they know one thing for certain. They know that countless people have come to this country and made a life so much better for themselves than they could ever have imagined. And it is why people still seek to come to this country. And it is why we should want those people to come to this country. Because whether it is the person who crawls across the desert to make $5, not 50 cents, a Sergey Brin who comes from Russia and founds Google, America should want the most ambitious and courageous people in the world to be a part of us. It is also true that if we are going to make our national myth a reality, we have to be able to answer that other part. It means that for Americans who are here, it has to matter not where you came from, but where you're going. And as Secretary of State, it worried me that there are pockets in America where that may no longer be true. As an educator, I find that devastating. You see, I come from a family where education was everything. My father's father was my great hero, a man named John Wesley Rice, Sr. And in 1919, he decided he wanted to get book learning. And so he asked how a colored man could get book learning and go to college, and they told him about Stillman College down the road. He saved up his cotton, he went to Stillman College, and he went through his first year of college, and then the second year they said, so how are you going to pay for the second year? And he said, well, I don't have any more money and no more cotton. They said, you'll have to leave. And thinking quickly, he said, so how are those boys going to school? They said, well, they have what's called a scholarship, and if you wanted to be a Presbyterian minister, you could have a scholarship too. And Granddaddy Rice said, well, you know, that's exactly what I had in mind. And my family has been college educated and Presbyterian ever since. But you know, my grandfather understood something. He understood the transforming power of education. He understood that he was going to be somebody he could never, ever have been without it. And when I think about what we need to do to strengthen our own democracy, I think about going back to what matters, to our creativity, to our innovation, to our belief in private sector-led growth, to our belief that not all of the answers come from government, that in fact they come from the people, that not all of the solutions come from Washington, but that they come from the people. But most importantly, that we believe that all of the people have a chance to reach their full potential. And that is only done when the educational system, which I'm afraid doesn't serve our kids very well today, is capable of delivering on the American dream, if you wish to call it that, the great national myth, which I wish to call it the log cabin. This is a terrific country, and we will be all right if we continue to focus on our core strengths, and if we stand with those who believe also in those core values. The United States of America will be just fine, finding again the optimism that led to the founding of this country against all odds, that led to the westward movement across the continental divide in covered wagons, that led to the day when the daughter of a man who could not vote in 1952 would find herself as Secretary of State, and yes, to the day when an African American would be elected President of the United States. That kind of optimism that Americans have, that what was one day seemed impossible, would one day seem inevitable, is the core of who we are. And it is why the United States of America will always lead and must always lead. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Madam Secretary. Secretary Rice has been kind enough to agree to answer some questions. We have just a few minutes for some questions. The one rule of thumb I would like to make is to just be sure to raise your hand, and before you stand up and ask your question, we will have one of our staff members that are floating around the rooms bring a microphone to you so that we can hear the question. Do we have any questions? Yes, right over here.
I would like to know which in history is your favorite Secretary of State?
Yes, in fact, I'll use the question to tell you. I kept 4 Secretaries of State's portraits near me. Thomas Jefferson, everybody has Thomas Jefferson, founding father, you remember him, first Secretary of State. I had George Marshall, probably the greatest Secretary of State of all time. Dean Acheson, the Secretary of State who, when he left office, was known for Who Lost China, and who we only remember now as the founder of NATO and laying the foundation for the end of the Cold War. And William Seward, because if ever today's headlines and history's judgments, William Seward, who bought Alaska from the Tsar of Russia, and who was accused of Seward's folly and Seward's icebox. And so Don Rumsfeld took the then Minister of Defense of Russia to Alaska, a man named Sergei Ivanov. And Sergei said to me, "You know, Condi, I thought Alaska was so beautiful." He said, "It reminded me of Russia." I said, "Sergei, it used to be Russia."
Yes, right here.
Thank you, Trudy. I have a question that's concerned me about one of our great leaders that I used to have as a boss at the Pentagon. And in fact, one of the times when the Judge Advocate General couldn't go to the Army-Navy game, John was told to go to the Army-Navy game with Colin Powell, who I admired a lot. President Reagan told me in this very building that he thought he'd make a good president, and I'm wondering what has happened to General Powell to cause him to go from being such a dynamic person in favor of the things you've been talking about to be wanting us to follow a president that's trying to lead us down the same road that Lenin led the Russians.
Look, Colin is a very good friend, and we are still in contact. He's an emailer, and we're in contact all the time. I think that Colin is somebody who does stand strongly for the values. This is a man that I've known since I was a young professor on the taking a year's leave on the Joint Staff, and he was National Security Advisor. And he's been very influential in my development and in my life. And I know what values he holds. And I've watched him and I've worked with him, and I know the values that he holds. There is nothing that I've said here today that I think he would disagree with. He believes in democracy. He fought for it. He wore the uniform and wore it proudly and wore it brilliantly, and believes a lot in the private sector. I don't know what led Colin to make the decisions that he made about this last election, but you know, people get to make, that's part of what we get as Americans. We get to make our choices at any given time, and we don't have to shed our party affiliation to do it. I think our party, the Republican Party, and I'm a Republican, I think the Republican Party, I think the Republican Party will be well served by broadening and not having a litmus test for being a Republican. I think the values that we share are pretty clear, and I welcome anybody that shares those values. I think we believe in a strong national defense for this country. I think we believe that America is exceptional in history and exceptional in the world, and therefore has to lead. That's what Ronald Reagan stood for. I think we believe in the private sector as the engine of growth. I think we believe in low regulation and letting the American people keep some of their own money in their own pockets because they'll spend it better than the government might do. And those are the core beliefs. And then we're going to disagree about a whole variety of issues. And sometimes we'll make choices that, some of us will make choices that are not appreciated or well understood by others. But let's stay focused on the need for a conservative movement that has answers to today's problems and tomorrow's challenges, but does so from the core values that have served us well in the past.
Up here.
From the balcony.
Thank you for coming, Madam Secretary. I was fortunate enough a few weeks ago to be at the Aspen Institute, where education was a major component of discussion. And I was wondering if you feel that the Obama administration is making the right steps into improving it, as we were once known as being the education guru, not just in universities, but also from K up, if you would. So I was wondering if you could answer that, please. Thank you.
Sure. I've taken an oath not to comment on how the Obama administration is doing. I think I'm with President Bush here. I think we owe them our silence and our loyalty. And I know what it's like to have people chirp at you from the sidelines when you're just trying to do your job. But let me just speak to a couple of things that I think are very important in the current debate about education reform. And there are some very strong reformists among superintendents now, whether it's Michelle Rhee in Washington or Joel Klein in New York or Beverly Hall in Atlanta. And actually Arne Duncan from Chicago, who's now current Secretary of Education, was one of those strong reformists among the superintendents. But what are we talking about? I first really became enamored of the agenda of George W. Bush, interestingly not around foreign policy, but around one phrase: the soft bigotry of low expectations. I have seen it when our schools believe that there are some kids who just can't learn, or maybe it's not that important that they learn, or maybe they ought to have self-esteem, so don't ever tell them that they're wrong. You know, it is really a civil rights issue that we warehouse so many of our kids and that we don't hold those accountable who are miseducating them. I'm all for spending more money in education. I'm all for spending more money for teachers. Teachers ought to be paid more. But I really believe we have to demand results for it in the classroom, from individual schools. I'm told, and I don't want to misquote the statistics, but I believe these statistics are right, that there are some 2,000 high schools in America that are responsible for 70% of the dropouts. Right? So we've got dropout factories. Why do we have them? And so what No Child Left Behind tried to do, and I think was very important, was to assess. You don't know how big the problem is unless you actually measure the problem. And so measurement continues to be important, and then accountability needs to be a part of it, and then teachers need to be rewarded for good performance in the schoolrooms, and those who don't believe that kids can be educated ought to get out of the way, because it's not their children that are being miseducated. Now, I do have one other point that I'd like to make, and it's a little bit special pleading. The one thing that I've seen drop out of the schools in too many places are the arts, music and the arts. They are not an add-on. They are an essential part of cognitive development, and they are an essential part of being able to stand up in front of adults and perform well. And I believe that if we go back to not just the basics, reading, writing, and arithmetic, but also to the arts, where kids that's how they get self-esteem. They learn to play and perform. We know that if you learn to play a musical instrument early, your brain imprints differently. And it, by the way, imprints in the same part that teaches you languages and perhaps mathematics. So I want to see a broader, enriched education for all of our children. And here, it really can't matter what your zip code is. You really have got to have access to a quality education.
Right here.
I would like to have you comment, if you would please, on the problems with the demise of newspapers and the result of just watching bites on television, and how it's going to affect a democracy.
Well, it's a very good question. I was as angry at the press some days as anybody. And as I said, it is really pleasant to get up and not read the newspaper thinking I have to do something about what's in it. I just get up, I read the newspaper, and I move on. But a democracy cannot function properly without information in breadth and depth. And I think that what we're losing is information in depth. There's lots of information out there, and you can watch cable television, and you can learn about any and everything you want to. But, by the way, I do watch cable television and not just ESPN, so I am a fan of cable television. But it is also true that you can't, in the 30-second soundbite or the 5-minute debate or even the 30-minute news show, learn in depth the way that you can from reading a newspaper. Now, whether you read it online or in a sheet, I think is another issue. But I worry about the demise of newspapers. I worry about the fact that so many good regional papers are in trouble, because regional papers are not just a reflection of the national news. They cover issues in regions that don't get covered. They cover state capitals that don't get covered. And I don't know how, I'm not smart enough to know what business model will bring them back. But I'll just tell you, very interesting, when I used to go to Moscow back in 84, 85, before Perestroika really opened up, the first people I would go to see were the journalists there, because they had a fingertip feel. They were out in the streets. And so foreign news coverage is important, having people who can go and cover countries on the ground. I can't give you an answer to how we fix it, but I think it is a really damaging turn of events. And newspapers and in-depth knowledge of events is extremely important to a well-functioning democracy.
We have time for one last question.
Hi. With everything that we hear about going on a daily basis between Israel, between Iran, North Korea, and that's on the world stage, and then the things we see happening in our own country right now, which looks like things are somewhat imploding, and then looking at your message of optimism, are these things real, what we're seeing, or are they simply an opportunity? And if they are, how do we turn it around?
Yes. Well, I believe that one reason I remain optimistic is the international system always has puts and takes. Some things are going well, some things are not going so well. And I actually think the Middle East is going better than advertised. When people say, oh, the Middle East is in so much worse shape as you're leaving than when you came, I think, well, what Middle East were we talking about? Was that the Middle East in which Al-Qaeda was bubbling up from the surface and had been created essentially in Saudi Arabia and was bubbling up from the surface? Is that the Middle East in which Saddam Hussein was putting 300,000 people in mass graves, flying, shooting at our aircraft practically every day, seeking weapons of mass destruction, threatening to invade Kuwait again? Was that the Middle East in which Syrian forces were deep into Lebanon, probably helping to assassinate Lebanese leaders? Which Middle East was it that was so great? Was that the Middle East in which Palestinians had launched a second intifada after Camp David failed, and Israelis were dying? Israelis and Palestinians were dying not just in the far reaches of Gaza, but in Tel Aviv. So when I look back, that Middle East doesn't look so great. And I look at the current Middle East, and I know it's very tough, but I see the following new pillars. I see in Iraq, which the most strategically important country in the Middle East, which used to be an implacable enemy of the United States, ruled by a maniacal dictator who did kill his own people, used weapons of mass destruction, and I see that replaced by a, to be sure, fragile, but democratic government in Iraq that is responsive to its people, that is going to be a bulwark against Iran because the Iraqis don't care for the Iranians and don't want them in their affairs. So I see that Iraq as potentially a very important part of the new Middle East. I see a Lebanon in which we have a democratically elected, Western-oriented government. Syrian forces are gone. That turns out to be important. I see a Palestinian leadership that is split, to be sure, but one part of it, under Mahmoud Abbas, that has given up on violence, believes in negotiation, is trying to build a decent life for people in the West Bank. And I see in Iran a very interesting phenomenon. I see that these bloody tyrants wanted somehow legitimacy. And so they held a fake election. And then they tried to win the fake election by more than they might have won it. And so 51% wasn't enough, it had to be 62.2%. And surprise, surprise, people reacted against that. And I don't care whether this regime lasts a year or 3 years or 5 years, it's done. It has lost any sense of legitimacy with its own people. This is a country in which the great majority, something I believe like 70% of the people are under the age of 35. And what now is their seminal political memory? It is what happened in Tehran in the streets. And so they've lost their best and their brightest forever. And in part, they lost it because the world turned on Ahmadinejad, and he was shown to be incompetent as well as a dictator. And that's a healthy development in Iran. Now, I feel for those people in the streets and the way that this brutal regime will put them down. But it's now a hollow shell. And if we don't do anything to prop it up, just like the Soviet Union was a hollow shell, it too will collapse. I don't know if it'll be next year or 5 years from now, but the Iranian regime, I believe, is done.
Well, We'll take one final question. Mr. Dreyfus.
Mr. Rice, I was very pleased that we began this evening with the Pledge of Allegiance, and I wanted to remind people that we have fought so bitterly over the phrase "under God," that we have forgotten that we are pledging allegiance to the Republic and that we don't teach the Republic in American public schools. We are the only sovereign in history, if Jefferson's words are to mean anything, who is not tutored. Aristotle tutored Alexander, and we are being tutored only by Rupert Murdoch. And that's not good enough. And I'm wondering if you could speak for a moment to those tools of civic expertise that must be taught to raise up devotion to a country that is bound only by ideas. And if those ideas are not taught, we are not bound.
Yes. Well, you've said it awfully well. You know, we are, in fact, bound by ideas and an ideal. But those ideas and those ideals are expressed in a history and a set of institutions that came into being for a specific set of reasons but have evolved over time in an ever better and more inclusive way. What's remarkable to me is that when Frederick Douglass advocated on behalf of slaves, or when Martin Luther King advocated on behalf of the oppressed, they did so within the context of America's institutions. They didn't have to go outside of those institutions. Those institutions were just fine. It's just we weren't living up to those institutions and to the ideals behind them. And somehow, generation after generation after generation has to understand that in order not to take them for granted, and in order not to take them for granted and to continue to fight for them, to continue to vote, to continue to work on behalf of those who are less fortunate, to insist that the press is free, to insist that freedom of religion is truly freedom of religion. You can be Muslim or Jewish or Catholic or Protestant or nothing at all, and you're still American, and that has to be taught. And I know we don't teach it in our schools. I had civics, by the way, in 4th grade. Now, it's true, it was taught in Alabama, so it was a little slanted toward the Confederacy, but that's all right. I was taught civics. We ought to teach it in our schools, and we ought to teach it unashamedly in our schools. It's not to say that others' systems, others' institutions are not valuable, are not good, to teach the value of your own. But America is exceptional. And what I would most want the next generation to understand is just how exceptional it is. Because as you go around the world, and difference is a license to kill, and you go around America, and you see the faces and hear the accents of every place on earth, whether they are Mexican American or Korean American or German American or African American, they're American. That is an extraordinary feat for human beings. I think we have to teach civics, we have to teach our institutions, and we have to teach how exceptional America is. There's nothing, to my mind, that is chauvinistic about that. It is simply the fact. And if we could get over our shyness, our disregard even, for the importance of passing those values on, that history on, and those responsibilities on, those obligations on, not just those rights, but those obligations, then I think we would be much the better for it.
Thank you very much, Secretary Rice. Thank you. Thank you so much for, excuse me, thank you so much for coming this evening. If you could just do us one favor and allow Mrs. Reagan and Secretary Rice to exit before you leave your seat, that would be terrific. Thank you so much.